The sound of police sirens tore through the neighborhood like a pack of wolves hunting down prey. Red and blue lights bounced off manicured hedges and polished SUVs, casting the whole cul-de-sac in a chaotic glow. And there I stood, motionless, in my own driveway, with nothing more incriminating in my hands than a set of keys and an oil-stained rag. Across the street, my dear HOA president clutched her phone like a holy relic, screaming for the officers to check the stolen vehicle hidden in that man's garage. Every neighbor's blinds quivered as faces pressed against glass, eager for a front-row seat to my public humiliation. The irony. The stolen car was mine. My father's legacy. But in that moment, the truth didn't matter. All that mattered was how loudly she could yell, and how quickly the cops could draw conclusions. The officer's flashlight sliced through the darkness and landed squarely on the gleaming chrome inside my garage. His partner reached for his cuffs. My heart hammered, not from guilt, but from sheer disbelief that my late father's pride and joy had just been labeled contraband by a woman who measured grass height for fun. This was about to spiral, and fast. But maybe I should back up. Because while this scene looks like the climax of some twisted suburban thriller, it was really just the latest chapter in a much longer war. And trust me, the ending? Oh, it was worth every second. By the time I was done, Karen and her precious HOA were left in ruins, while my so-called stolen car shined brighter than ever. Before I unravel how it all went down, let me pause for a second. Where are you watching from? I always love seeing where these HOA horror stories travel. Drop it in the comments. And stick around, because the revenge part? It's coming, and it's not the kind of revenge you can scrub off with a fine notice or a clipboard. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 6 months, I've been running a small restoration business out of my garage. Before that, I was an aerospace engineer, the kind of guy who spent his days buried in schematics, calculating tolerances down to fractions of millimeters. Precision is second nature to me, and when you combine that with a lifelong obsession for cars passed down from my dad, you get someone who doesn't just restore vehicles. I resurrect them. The centerpiece of my collection was a 1968 Shelby GT 500 Eleanor, a car my father started restoring decades ago but never got the chance to finish before cancer stole him away. For me, this wasn't just steel and paint. It was a bridge to the past. Every bolt I turned felt like a conversation with the old man, every polished panel like hearing his laugh again. Which made it all the more insulting when Karen, clipboard warrior, HOA president, and neighborhood self-appointed detective, decided to brand it stolen property. And here's the kicker. That accusation wasn't random. It was calculated. Karen had been circling me like a vulture for months, sniffing for any excuse to drag me down. She hated the hum of an engine, the faint smell of oil, and the idea that someone could create something meaningful outside the HOA's rigid, lifeless playbook. The garage was my sanctuary, but to her, it was a crime scene waiting to happen. Little did she know, though, the game she had just started was one I was destined to finish. Because when you push a man who builds machines with military precision, and when you insult the only thing connecting him to his father, you better be ready for the blowback. And this was just the opening act. The feud didn't start with the police. No, that was just her grand finale. It started months earlier, the very first week I moved into the neighborhood. I had barely unloaded half my boxes when I got my first HOA notice. Garage must remain closed when not in use. It was almost laughable, considering my garage was more a workshop than a parking space. But that was the HOA for you. Rules written by people who couldn't change their own tire but somehow knew how everyone else should live. Still, I played along. At first. I kept the door down, tried to keep the noise reasonable, even invested in soundproofing panels. But a 1968 Shelby doesn't exactly purr like a Prius. And when I fired it up, you could feel the vibrations crawl through the cul-de-sac like a living thing. Kids peeked out, fascinated. Dads slowed down during their morning jogs, pretending not to stare. Even a few neighbors would swing by, curious, offering nods of appreciation. Karen, however, was not impressed. To her, my garage wasn't a symbol of craftsmanship or dedication. It was a nuisance. She marched around with her clipboard, whispering to anyone who would listen that Ethan thinks he can turn this neighborhood into a mechanic strip mall. She didn't like grease-stained rags hanging on hooks. She didn't like the faint smell of gasoline drifting down the street. And she especially didn't like the idea that I had something she couldn't control. The first escalation came in the form of fines. $50 for working on unapproved vehicles. $100 for operating a commercial business from a residential property. $200 for disturbance of neighborhood peace. Each envelope that landed in my mailbox felt less like an official notice and more like a bad joke. I half expected the next one to say, "Fine, $500 for daring to breathe in HOA territory." At first, I ignored them. Then I appealed. I even sat through one of their committee meetings, where Karen sat at the head of the table like a general leading her troops. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge me, just tapped her pen against the clipboard every time I spoke. I presented receipts proving the Shelby was mine, proof that my work wasn't a commercial business, and even letters from supportive neighbors. Didn't matter. Karen had already decided I was guilty. And here's where it gets interesting, because the fines weren't really about rules. They were about power. Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control, and my garage was a constant reminder that she didn't control me. So she pushed harder. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright orange violation sticker slapped across my garage door, like some kind of scarlet letter for suburban rebels. My neighbors looked away, embarrassed, as though associating with me might earn them one of their own. I peeled it off, tossed it in the trash, and laughed. But deep down, I knew what this meant. Karen wasn't going to stop. And I wasn't going to roll over. So I played the long game. I started documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every whisper of harassment. I took photos, saved receipts, even installed a couple of discreet security cameras pointed at the garage and the street. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew people like Karen. They thrived on intimidation, but the moment you dragged sunlight onto their antics, they wilted. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just some grease monkey tinkering on weekends. I had years of experience in aerospace engineering, which meant I had patience, discipline, and an eye for detail that could spot a loose bolt at 10 feet. I wasn't about to let a suburban tyrant bully me into giving up the one thing that mattered most. But the real breaking point came 2 weeks before the police sirens. It was a hot evening, the kind where the air sticks to your skin and cicadas scream from the trees. I had the Shelby's hood up, wiping sweat from my forehead as I tightened a final bolt. That's when I heard it, Karen's voice, carrying across the street like a rusty trumpet. She was holding court with 2 other board members, pointing directly at my garage, waving her arms like I was a criminal mastermind running an underground chop shop. Her words weren't meant for me. They were meant for the audience. She was planting seeds, that Ethan Miller wasn't just annoying, he was dangerous. And if you repeat a lie enough times, people start to wonder if maybe there's truth to it. I stood there, rag in hand, pretending not to listen. But my blood boiled. This wasn't about noise anymore. This wasn't about rules. This was about character assassination. She wanted me gone, and she was willing to twist reality to make it happen. That's when I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't just fight back. I'd make sure she regretted every fine, every accusation, every smug smile she'd ever thrown my way. I didn't know it then, but the opportunity for revenge was already on the horizon. Because while Karen was busy fabricating stories about my so-called illegal operation, she was blind to her own mistakes. And when those mistakes surfaced, I'd be ready. But until then, the tension only grew. Notices piled up. Neighbors grew curious. And Karen's paranoia reached new heights. She began circling my driveway, taking photos, muttering into her phone, building her case like some suburban detective out of a budget TV drama. And then came the night she made the call. The night she decided my Shelby wasn't just unapproved, or a nuisance, or a violation. She decided it was stolen. That accusation lit the fuse. And when the fuse finally burned down, the explosion was loud enough to take down the entire HOA. Blue and red lights. That's the memory burned into my brain like a bad photograph. My quiet street, lined with trimmed hedges, squeaky clean mailboxes, and overpriced SUVs, suddenly looked like the backdrop of a crime show. Kids pressed their faces against windows. Dogs barked from backyards. And there I stood, leaning against my garage door, rag in hand, watching the circus arrive. The first officer stepped out with the same swagger you'd expect if he had just busted a high-profile drug ring. Karen practically skipped across the lawn to meet him, arms flailing, voice pitched high enough to scare birds from the trees. From her theatrics, you'd think I had a basement full of chopped-up cars and stolen parts ready for shipment overseas. I didn't move. Didn't argue. Didn't give her the satisfaction. Because here's the thing about situations like this, the louder your accuser gets, the calmer you need to be. It's like throwing water on a grease fire. The more frantic you are, the worse it gets. So I let her screech, let the neighbors gawk, let the officers strut like heroes walking into danger. Meanwhile, my Shelby gleamed under the fluorescent light, polished to perfection, legal title tucked neatly in my filing cabinet. The officers asked questions. Where did the car come from? Why was it in my garage? Did I have proof of ownership? Karen hovered nearby, eavesdropping, ready to pounce at any sign of weakness. I could practically hear her thoughts. Gotcha, Ethan. Finally gotcha. Too bad for her. I had every receipt, every document, every scrap of proof organized and ready. Aerospace engineering teaches you a lot, but mostly it teaches you to never underestimate paperwork. I pulled out the file, handed it over, and watched the officers flip through it. Their shoulders slumped as the adrenaline drained. This wasn't the big bust they'd imagined. Karen's face was priceless. Her triumphant smirk twisted into confusion, then horror, then a simmering rage that could have melted asphalt. She tried to backpedal, muttering about suspicious behavior and community safety, but the officers weren't buying it. One of them even gave me a look, half apology, half amusement, as they packed up their notepads and left. The sirens faded, but the damage was done. My driveway had been a stage, and the whole neighborhood had tickets to the show. Some shook their heads in sympathy. Others whispered behind closed blinds. But all of them had seen the same thing. Karen, the almighty HOA president, had overplayed her hand. And that's when I realized something important. Karen didn't just want me gone. She wanted control so badly that she was willing to weaponize the police to get it. That wasn't just petty, that was dangerous. And if I let her keep going, she'd escalate until something truly irreversible happened. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to just defend myself. I was going to dismantle her. Piece by piece. The first step? Information. Revenge isn't about brute force, it's about leverage. I already had months of records. Her fines, her harassment, her baseless accusations. But I needed more. Something concrete. Something the board couldn't ignore. So while Karen strutted around pretending her call to the police had been a noble act of safety enforcement, I quietly dug deeper. I attended more HOA meetings, sitting in the back like a ghost, listening. Karen couldn't help herself. She loved the sound of her own voice. The more she spoke, the more she revealed, about budgets, about landscaping contracts, about administrative expenses that didn't quite add up. My ears perked up at that. Numbers don't lie, but people do. And I had a hunch Karen was lying to everyone, not just about me. Meanwhile, my security cameras kept rolling. Every late-night lap around my driveway, every photo she snapped of my garage, every whispered conversation caught at just the right angle. Piece by piece, I was building a timeline, not of me, but of her. Because while she wanted the neighborhood to see me as the villain, her own paranoia was painting a much clearer picture. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had called the police on an innocent man, claiming I was hiding something stolen. But in truth, she was the one hiding skeletons. She just hadn't realized that someone like me had the patience to wait, watch, and record until the cracks in her perfect facade split wide open. And here's the kicker. My patience was about to pay off sooner than I expected. Because just 2 weeks after the police fiasco, I stumbled onto the thread that would unravel everything. A financial discrepancy in the HOA's maintenance budget. Nothing huge at first. Just a few $1,000s missing. But when you tug on a loose thread, sometimes the whole sweater comes apart. That's when I knew. Her downfall was inevitable. All I had to do was keep pulling. So while Karen puffed out her chest and spread her lies about the suspicious man with the loud garage, I smiled, nodded, and kept my head down. Outwardly, I looked beaten. Inwardly, I was laying the foundation for the kind of revenge that doesn't just sting, it scorches. Because when you spend your life restoring cars, you learn something important. The real beauty isn't in the shine. It's in the rebuild. And I was about to rebuild Karen's carefully curated empire into rubble. The night I found the discrepancy in the HOA budget, I couldn't sleep. My laptop screen glowed in the dark like a campfire, numbers flickering across spreadsheets. Landscaping, pool maintenance, community improvement projects. All legitimate on paper, but when I cross-referenced invoices against actual expenses, holes. Big ones. Money was missing. Thousands. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Karen wasn't just a nosy tyrant with a whistle in her throat. She was a thief hiding behind manicured hedges and fake smiles. And the best part? She didn't even cover her tracks well. It was like finding duct tape holding together the frame of a luxury car. Sloppy. Obvious. Begging to be exposed. Here's where my engineering brain kicked in. In aerospace, precision is survival. Miss 1 decimal, and you don't get a second chance. I treated this the same way. I built a file, organized, dated, bulletproof. Copies of invoices, emails from contractors, payment logs, screenshots from HOA portals. Evidence that Karen had siphoned HOA funds into consulting fees paid to her own shell company. And then I thought about the irony. She had called the cops on me, screaming about a stolen car. Meanwhile, she was the one actually stealing, not metal and engines, but the money her neighbors had trusted her to protect. It almost made me laugh. Almost. But I didn't want laughter. I wanted silence. The kind of silence that falls when a bomb goes off, and everyone is too stunned to move. That was the reaction I was aiming for. Of course, I couldn't just drop the file and walk away. Timing mattered. If I went too early, she'd wriggle free, spin her lies, rally her little board of sycophants. No, I needed her cocky. I needed her to think she'd won. That way, when the trap snapped shut, she wouldn't just fall. She'd shatter. So I played along. I let the rumors spread. I let neighbors whisper about the guy hiding a stolen car in his garage. I kept my head down at meetings while Karen paraded around like she was some kind of suburban queen. The more she gloated, the sweeter the downfall would taste. Meanwhile, my cameras kept rolling. And one evening, around 10:30, I caught her creeping across my driveway again. Clipboard in hand, phone flashlight sweeping over my garage door. She paused, scribbled something, then looked straight at the camera. My camera, with this smug little smirk, like she thought she was untouchable. I smiled when I replayed the footage. Not only was she incompetent, she was arrogant enough to leave me breadcrumbs. And arrogance? That's the easiest weakness to exploit. The turning point came at the next HOA meeting. Karen had the floor, droning on about protecting property values and neighborhood safety. She slipped in a jab about residents with questionable activities in their garages, and the room chuckled nervously. I sat in the back, silent, my file burning a hole in my bag. I could have ended it right then. Pulled out the evidence, dropped it on the table, watched her empire crumble. But that would have been too easy. Too clean. Instead, I waited. Because real revenge isn't about the strike, it's about the build-up. The anticipation. The moment when the audience realizes the hero has been holding the dagger all along. And make no mistake, I was holding it. What Karen didn't know was that I had already shared parts of my file with two people, a neighbor she trusted, and a board member she thought was firmly in her pocket. Seeds planted. Whispers started. And if you've ever lived in an HOA community, you know gossip spreads faster than wildfire in a dry forest. By the time Karen strutted out of that meeting, neighbors were already side-eyeing her. Conversations hushed when she walked by. She could feel it too. I saw it in the way her smile twitched, the way her eyes darted around like a cornered animal. She didn't know why, not yet. But she could sense it. The walls were closing in. And that's the beauty of revenge. You don't always have to push. Sometimes you just loosen the screws and let gravity do the work. By the end of that week, the board scheduled an emergency session to review finances. Karen brushed it off as routine, but I knew better. The trap was set. The bait was in place. All that was left was for her to walk into it. And she would. Because people like Karen always do. The emergency financial review meeting wasn't just another HOA gathering with cookies, tepid coffee, and Karen's monotone power trip. This was theater. A stage set for collapse. I could feel it the second I walked in. Neighbors shifted in their seats, whispering in tight circles. The board members sat stiff and quiet, papers stacked neatly in front of them. Even the air felt heavier, like the room knew what was coming before anyone said a word. Karen, of course, had no idea. She walked in with her usual swagger, clicking heels, clutching a folder like it contained state secrets. Her smile was plastic, stretched too wide, too confident. She loved this spotlight. She thought this was her arena, her chance to tighten her grip on the neighborhood she treated like her personal kingdom. But kingdoms don't last forever. The treasurer cleared his throat first, voice shaky but firm. There have been discrepancies. That one word cracked the room open. Neighbors leaned forward. Chairs squeaked. Karen froze for half a second, then plastered on another fake smile. Discrepancies. A polite way of saying, someone's been siphoning off funds. And when the treasurer laid out the numbers, inflated invoices, payments to consultants no one had ever seen, checks signed off under Karen's authority, the silence was suffocating. Karen tried to laugh it off, of course. She waved her hand, spun a story about clerical errors and temporary reallocations. But the board wasn't buying it. And neither were the neighbors. That's when I struck. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even stand up at first. I just pulled out my file, neatly tabbed, highlighted, impossible to ignore, and slid it across the table. Evidence. Emails. Bank transfers. Photos. Even that late-night footage of Karen snooping around my garage, flashlight in hand, looking like a burglar in yoga pants. The reaction was instant. Gasps. Murmurs. Heads turning. Karen's smile cracked for real this time, her face flushing red as she realized the walls weren't just closing in, they had already collapsed. I finally stood, letting the silence hang a beat too long, then dropped the line I'd been saving for weeks. Funny, isn't it? You called 911 on me for hiding a stolen car, while you were busy stealing from the entire neighborhood. If looks could kill, I would have been vaporized on the spot. But Karen couldn't fire back. She stammered, sputtered, reaching for excuses that dissolved in the air before they left her lips. The board demanded answers. Neighbors shouted questions. And for the first time, Karen wasn't in control. She was drowning. I didn't need to twist the knife. The crowd did it for me. Voices rose, accusations flew, and all Karen could do was shrink under the weight of her own lies. Her power evaporated right there in that clubhouse, under fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee. But here's the thing about revenge. Exposure is satisfying, sure. But it's not enough. I wanted permanence. I wanted her stripped of every ounce of control she had ever stolen. So when the board voted that night to suspend her pending a full audit, I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of her public unraveling. Because once the audit hit daylight, Karen wouldn't just lose her title. She'd lose everything. The audit didn't take months. It took weeks. Weeks where the neighborhood buzzed like a live wire, where every driveway conversation and mailbox stop turned into speculation about just how deep Karen's claws had gone into our pockets. And when the results finally came back, they weren't just damning, they were catastrophic. Tens of thousands gone. Fake vendors. Personal expenses hidden under community beautification. Trips billed as leadership retreats. Karen hadn't just dipped into the HOA funds, she'd turned them into her private ATM. The board called a special meeting, one final act in this soap opera, and the turnout was bigger than a holiday block party. Neighbors packed the clubhouse, arms crossed, waiting. Karen tried to keep her chin high, but the panic showed in her twitching hands, in the way her eyes darted for an exit. She wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was the defendant. The treasurer read the findings line by line, each number another nail in her coffin. The board's lawyer explained the legal implications. Misuse of funds. Breach of fiduciary duty. Fraud. It wasn't just HOA politics anymore. It was criminal. Karen cracked in real time. The denial slipped first. Then came the pleading, the excuses, the tears. But the neighbors weren't swayed. They remembered the fines, the threats, the screaming fits. They remembered her storming across lawns like a self-appointed sheriff. And now they were watching her empire burn. The board voted unanimously to remove her. Effective immediately. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. A formal complaint was filed with the district attorney's office. Civil suits followed. Karen went from lording over pool passes and trash can violations to facing real consequences, the kind that strip away reputations, savings, and peace of mind. And me? I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to rub it in. My victory was written on every neighbor's face as they walked out of that clubhouse lighter, freer, no longer under Karen's thumb. I closed my garage that night and stared at the car that started it all. My father's car. My project. The so-called stolen machine that exposed a thief far bigger than anyone imagined. I ran a rag across the hood, and for the first time in months, the silence of my driveway wasn't tense. It was peaceful. Funny, isn't it? Karen screamed that I was hiding a stolen car inside my garage. Turns out, the only thief in this story was her. So here's where I'll leave you. If you've ever dealt with a Karen, an HOA nightmare, or a neighbor who thought they ran the world, tell me your story. Drop it in the comments. I'll be watching.